Okay, so in this video, I will talk about the 5 levels of front-end engineering. Sort of. The first 2 levels deal with programming fundamentals and computer science fundamentals. So at level 1, this is where we begin our journey. And at this level, we only focus on programming fundamentals. And by that, I'm only referring to variables, control flow, and that includes for loops, while loops, if-else statements, and switch statements, and functions. So these are the bare basics that you need. You need to understand how to declare variables, you need to understand control flow, and you need to understand what functions are. These principles, they are constant across all languages. Each language has its own way of declaring variables, its own way of declaring for loops, while loops, if-else statements, and switch statements. And of course, each programming language has its own way of defining functions. To clear this level, you need to understand these basics. Level 2, Intro to Computer Science Fundamentals. At this level, you typically learn C++, which is used for the entire course. From day 1, we learn about what pointers are. You also learn about dynamically allocating memory and deallocating that memory. And almost immediately, we jump right into object-orienting programming principles, or classes. When learning about classes, these are the topics that are typically covered: constructors, destructors, private and public methods, private and public variables, operator overloading, inheritance, and polymorphism. Classes are all about reusability and encapsulation. At a high level, we use classes to encapsulate algorithms that we define that operate on data structures that we also define. This is abstracted away into interface functions. Via interface functions, the user can access indirectly the algorithms that we have defined under the hood that operate on the data structures that we have also defined. After we learn about classes, we start to look at our first data structures. And the first 3 that you encounter, or I encountered, were linked lists, stacks, and queues. And the next big topic that comes up as well is our first algorithm, recursion. And this took some time getting used to, but now that I look back, it wasn't too bad. After learning about recursion, we then spend some time learning about templates and the C++ standard template library. We then move on to big O notation, which is another very important topic in computer science, and this is where we learn about space-time complexity. We then move on to sorting algorithms, and we learn about the following: selection, insertion, bubble sort, and shell sort. These algorithms are rarely used in practice because they are inefficient, but they serve as the foundation or the building blocks to learn how to think about sorting. The last 2 sorting algorithms that we learn about are quicksort and merge sort. These algorithms are the ones you will use in production because they're very efficient. And finally, we finish off the course with some more data structures. We are first introduced to binary trees, and very quickly, we pivot over to binary search trees. We then spend some time on hash tables, and we spend about a lecture or 2 on priority queues, and we end the course learning about graphs. And here, this is where we learn about adjacency lists and adjacency matrices, depth first search, breadth first search, and Dijkstra's algorithm. And so the next level is LeCode. Not really, but in all seriousness, you need to practice your data structures and algorithms, and LeCode is a website that allows you to do just that. All right, so don't forget to practice data structures and algorithms after you learn them, so after level 2, and you should check out LeCode 75, which is based on Blind 75. So it's a collection of programming problems that help you practice data structures and algorithms. Okay, on to level 3. This is what I like to refer as the JavaScript fundamentals. So at this point, you want to pick an IDE, and you should pick VS Code and stick with VS Code. So when you get to this level, this is what you need to focus on. You always want to use strict mode, right? This just adds more guardrails to avoid shooting yourself in the foot. Next, you want to learn about data types in JavaScript, right? You want to learn about primitives, and here I listed a few: null, string, and number, and everything else you can consider non-primitives. So these would be arrays, objects, and functions. Then you want to learn about variable declarations. So you want to learn about var, let, and const. And as you're learning about variable declarations, you learn about scoping. And you want to learn about function scope versus globally scoped. And you also want to learn about block scoped variables. You then want to spend some time here and learn about type coercion. So you want to learn about truthy and falsy values in JavaScript. And only then should you look at control flow, right? You want to look at the if-else statements and for loops. You want to look at pre-ES6, and by ES6, I mean modern JavaScript. ES6 introduces a few new ways to create for loops. So when you're first learning control flow, you want to stick to the basic for loop, and of course you want to look at while loops and switch statements. So the reason I put control flow down here is because if you don't know about type coercion, and if you don't know about the scoping rules in JavaScript, and if you decide to learn control flow without knowing about type coercion or scoping rules, you're going to encounter some nasty bugs and you won't know how to fix them. Another very important topic in JavaScript is to learn about the this keyword. So here you got to spend some time. It's very different than in other languages. After you learn about the this keyword, you should learn about ES6 classes, or the modern way of creating classes in JavaScript. Then you want to learn ES6. So in general, you just want to learn modern JavaScript features. And this you can learn at a later time if you want to just keep moving along the list. So the next important thing is you need to learn about how to create classes without ES6, or the old way. And this should only be done, in my opinion, after learning about ES6 classes. When you learn how to create classes the old way, you learn about prototypal inheritance and the prototype chain. So this is how JavaScript implements inheritance, and it's a very, very important topic. Another important topic is closures. So here is where you'll learn about the lexical environment. In a nutshell, functions bundled together with its surrounding state. And this topic is tricky to explain in a sentence or two. And finally, you want to learn about the global execution context. So this is the big picture. This is how JavaScript gets executed. And I actually made a whole video on this. I'll make sure to link that. And just some quick pointers. You should learn the left side from top to bottom, while on the right side, you can pick and choose the order. And then finally, don't forget to learn JavaScript. But I recommend you learn JavaScript after you get down here, after you learn about ES6 classes. And so now at level 4, this is where you learn about the DOM and the DOM API. So what is the DOM, or the Document Object Model? So the DOM represents the structure of the document, and this is where HTML enters. And actually, before I forget, you use CSS to style pages, and when you pick up HTML, you should also pick up CSS, and you should learn HTML and CSS sometime before getting to level 4. So when you visit a website, at a high level, the web browser loads the HTML file or the document. So it takes all of the HTML elements, and for each of the HTML elements, it constructs nodes. And behind the scenes, this is mostly done in C++. So once we construct all the nodes, then these nodes that represent our DOM are loaded into memory. And so these nodes correspond to what the user sees, like buttons or paragraphs, for example. And at this point is where we start learning about the DOM API, or user interactivity. So what should happen when the user clicks a button? Think of YouTube and all of the user interactivity. What should happen when the user clicks play or stop? So at this point, the DOM is in memory. And so the DOM API is a set of functions to access, read, write, create, manipulate the DOM nodes in memory. So via JavaScript functions, DOM API, we indirectly access the C++ code to manipulate the DOM nodes. And inevitably, while you are here, you will learn about asynchronous JavaScript. So this is where you learn about promises, and the reason I put promises is because when you explore asynchronous JavaScript, the first thing you learn about are promises. And after learning about promises, you learn about the fetch API, which is promise-based, and this is a web browser API. And when you learn about the fetch API, you learn about HTTP requests, which are used to fetch data. And typically the first HTTP request that you learn about is the GET request. It's simple and straightforward. Another very important topic that you need to learn about is the JS event loop. And the JS event loop is made up of the following things, right? The event loop itself, the call stack, the task queue, and the microtask queue. So the microtask queue was introduced when ES6 was introduced, and it was specifically created to handle promises. At a high level, this is how the event loop works. We can go back and think about YouTube and how the user will interact with the website. As the user clicks around, we need to execute code. And so the event loop is always ready to go, and it's always ready to execute code. So what the event loop will do is actually it will look at the microtask queue first because it's prioritized over the task queue. First, it'll check the microtask queue and look to see if we have any promise-based functions to execute. If we do have something to execute, it'll take that function, place it on the call stack, invoke that function, and once the function is done running, it'll remove it from the call stack. Then it'll take a look at the task queue and repeat the process. Right? If we have something to execute, we execute it. If we don't, we move on. Then we repeat the process. The event loop looks at the microtask queue. If there's something there, execute it. If there's nothing there, look in the task queue. If we have a function to execute in the task queue, we take the function, we execute it, and then we're done. Right? And so this is what the event loop is always doing. It's checking the microtask queue, then it checks the task queue. Then repeat. Check the microtask queue, check the task queue, repeat the process again. Check the microtask queue, check the task queue, repeat. So at a high level, this is how the JavaScript event loop works. And finally, once you make it past the first 4 levels, you're ready to enter the JavaScript framework ecosystem. So when you get here, you want to pick an IDE, and I recommend sticking with VS Code. The next thing you'll want to do is pick a framework, and 3 of the popular ones are React, Vue, and Angular. And very quickly, Next.js is actually a framework built on top of React. And nowadays, if you want to use React, pick Next.js. And so these frameworks are abstractions over the DOM and the DOM API. They're supposed to simplify the development process when creating web applications. If you don't understand the fundamentals of the DOM and how it works and the DOM API, it's going to be hard to understand why we need something like React, Vue, or Angular. And of course, there's newer frameworks, and 2 of them, like Svelte and Solid.js, and of course there are others. Actually, every 5 minutes a new framework is born. And the next thing you want to choose is a CSS framework, which again, it's an abstraction over vanilla CSS, but you should only choose a CSS framework if you understand vanilla CSS. One of the more popular ones, and the one I use, is Tailwind CSS, and it's the one I recommend. Then you want to look at a testing framework, and I recommend using Vitess. It's what I use now. And then finally, another important thing that you need is linting. So make sure to either install ESLint or TSLint if you're working with TypeScript. If you took the time and went through the first 4 levels, by the time you get here, you're not worried about learning fundamentals. Here, you can solely focus on building web applications and trying out new libraries and frameworks. And at some point, you want to take a look at what module bundlers are. And one of the popular ones is Vite or Vite. And at a high level, and so what a bundler does, it takes these abstractions over the DOM API or these abstractions over vanilla CSS, and it'll transpile the code down into something the web browser can understand. So it's very important that you don't skip the first 4 levels, because it seems that a lot of people want to skip through the first 4 levels, and by the time you get here, so much has been abstracted away that you just don't know what you don't know. You don't know why we want to use something like React, and you don't know why we want to use something like a CSS framework. So if you go through the first 4 levels and take your time, by the time you get here, you should be able to navigate this level, or at least it should be easier to navigate this level. And this is important because every level before this level builds on each other. Not only are you learning programming fundamentals, but you're learning how to teach yourself. You're learning how to be self-sufficient, but more importantly, you're learning the fundamentals. The fundamentals don't change, but the JavaScript framework ecosystem is changing all the damn time. Having the fundamentals makes it easy to adapt when change inevitably occurs. Right, so I made this video because when I first got started, it was difficult navigating this realm. I wish somebody would have taken the time to break down the process. And the roadmaps that I did encounter, I felt were too noisy. There was just too much going on. Even though it was structured, at each level, you had way too many damn options. And honestly, at each level, I felt that there was a lot of superficial information, and it didn't really get to the heart of what you should be learning. So anyways, this is why I made this video, because this is what I did, and this is how I got hired as a front-end engineer. Anyways, I hope you guys found this video useful, and also don't forget to like and subscribe.